All right. You've came to this course and presumably are interested a bit in learning about containers. So maybe you have an idea of containers, maybe you don't. But here in this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about why should you be motivated to learn about containers. This is our licensing information for this course. Okay, so the chapter learning objectives for this chapter is that we're going to understand that computing environments are moving targets. We're going to work to understand the motivation for using containers in a scientific software development or analysis setting. And we're going to recognize containers as a tool for reproducibility. So let's dive in. So our computers are kind of like snowflakes, okay? Each one is unique. And so in this image, we're seeing two different folks who have computers, and each of these little hexagons here is representing a software dependency perhaps that they have, and they're all kind of related in a different way. They have different version numbers, and these two different people then might have some of the same software installed, but ultimately it's going to be a very unique situation. And you can imagine sometimes you have your computer do updates even when you don't know about it. And so it's nearly impossible to find two computers that are exactly alike. So we can see this from example output. So here's an example of a session environment from R, which is basically just a printout of what's being kind of used in that computing session. So we can see that there's different R versions. We could see that these are being run on two different operating systems. One is Ubuntu, one is Mac. And then there's also, for each of the packages that are attached, there might be different version numbers. 2.4 are marked on versus 2.1. And so this is something that is not only true in a static point in time if we take two computers, but it's also true that it's continually changing over time, right? You have updates, you have things that you're adding on your computer as you're working, things that are being added in the background that you don't know about, or certain software might be kind of fading out of existence, so it's deprecating. And why is this important? It's because computing environments ultimately do affect analysis results. So we could see this. This is from a paper from Casey Green and Bilo Jones' lab. We can see that these are three different systems that ran the same analysis, and you get different gene numbers for these different that same analysis, right? But different computer. And so we got to ask ourselves, this is a reproducibility problem now. How do we make sure that our results are truly reproducible? What if 5 of those genes that are the difference here and here, what if 5 of those were something we were going to pursue? That would be really important to know. And that's something we need to figure out on a reproducibility standpoint. So what is reproducibility? We talk about this in some other courses, especially if you're doing this as a part of a specialization. But at the very bottom of this pyramid, we can see that we have repeatability. That means as the same researcher using the same data, same code, can you get your same results, right? If you run it this morning and then you run your analysis this afternoon, can you get the same results reliably? That is what repeatability is all about. Now, reproducibility is when we hand it to a friend, a collaborator, somebody, and say, hey, here's my code, here's my data. Can you get the same results as me? Okay, this is now we're venturing a little bit more outside of our current lab, maybe. And then the reason that reproducibility is so key and so important is that it is the step before we get to replicability. So replicability is where we might collect new data on something that is building upon what we found in the results that we hopefully reproduced. So if something is not reproducible and now we're trying to extrapolate and like build on to that and continue the move of science, we might have some problems if that work wasn't exactly as reproducible as we thought. So to clarify, though, reproducibility does not mean it's correct, right? You could be consistently wrong in the same way. However, you can't be inconsistently right. Does that make sense? Let me say that again. You can be consistently wrong, but you can't be inconsistently right. Which means that if you are in a place where you need to trust your results and you want to believe that they are sensing some sort of ground truth about the world that you're observing, which is what science is all about, then you need them to be consistent. That's a requirement. It has to be consistent, which is what reproducibility is about. But just because they are consistent doesn't mean that they are valid or correct. So that's a different question, not something we can address in this course. So you might think, okay, how do we get around this problem? Why don't we just ship our laptops to each other? If no two laptops are the same, if I ship my laptop to somebody else, then they could rerun it. Well, obviously that's, we could think about that for more than 2 seconds and we'd find that that's problematic. Just the costs of it all, just like what if multiple people want to reproduce your results? There's obviously we're just being silly at this point. Okay, that's not a practical solution. So, what is a practical solution? Containers. Containers are kind of like your computer is pretending to be someone else inside of it. It's kind of like it's running a different computer inside of it. You may have heard the term virtual machine. That's slightly different than a container, but it is kind of the idea that there is something running in your computer that is isolated from the rest of your computer. And so we're going to talk more about how that's helpful for us. So if we're using containers, then you may have heard of Docker. That's a very popular brand for containers. It could look like this, where that same researcher we kind of were talking about before, maybe she's got a computing environment that looks like this. Well, if she's doing it on a container, that makes it so she can ship the image to somebody else, and then they can download it, and they can get the exact same computing environment on their computer and get the same exact results. And that is exactly what we want. And in fact, that's what that paper that we previewed a little bit earlier was showing us, is that this is a verified way that we can make sure that we have at least this part of the reproducibility puzzle solid and locked down, okay? So the other part of it is that not even just from a reproducibility standpoint, sometimes installing things can be very time consuming and nearly feels impossible, okay? And containers can be a way to get around that. Sometimes they talk about dependency hell, and that refers to when you install one thing and it actually requires you to install another thing, but then if you have trouble installing that thing or the 10 other things that it needs, you can get kind of stuck in this vortex of you just wanted this original software piece and now you have about 10 other things you have to install. That could be a real frustrating place to be in. A lot of us have been there before. And so containers can be a way that we can try to avoid that and not waste our time trying to get our computer aligned exactly for just the one analysis, right? So to recap, our top reasons for using containers: it helps with reproducibility. It helps with sharing the computing environments we used, so which is also related to reproducibility. It can help us avoid installation problems, so less installation problems, and it can really be handy for testing, actually. And we didn't really talk about that yet, but if you took our automation course, you may have heard us kind of mention about containers, and this is something that we can talk about more in the capstone course here. But yeah, it can be really handy for testing things in a variety of ways. So let's talk about some terms then. I threw out the term image, okay, real briefly a second ago, and I didn't define it. So let's talk about what that means. So when you have a computing environment, and we've seen these kinds of little images and cartoons before, you can take what's kind of like a snapshot of that computing environment, and that's something you can share with somebody else very easily. It's like collapsed, it's there, it's all ready to go, and then the other person, or maybe that other person is you, can build that container from that image, from the information in that snapshot. They will build the container, and then that container is where they can do stuff, okay? So to kind of talk about this more, first of all, there are different container options. There's Docker. There's also Singularity, which is now being called Apptainer. So there's a lot of different things. We are going to mostly focus on Docker in this course, but there are different options here. So this is how I think of images versus containers. I think of an image being kind of like when Mary Poppins is looking at this thing on the ground. It's kind of like, just flat and 2D. And then when you do Docker run, which is what we'll do in the next chapter, you turn it into a container. And now you can live in it. You can go do stuff. You can play in there, whatever. But that's kind of the relationship of an image to a container in a very intuitive sense and not at all a very technical one. So hopefully this gave you a little bit of an intro of why containers, and we'll dive in more in this next chapter.